The woman's whisper cut through the night like a dying prayer. I'm filthy, inside and out. Jonah Cade's hand trembled on the blanket's edge, 10 years of peace shattered by 3 gunshots, and a secret that could destroy them both. What he saw beneath that wool would change everything. The rope burns, the needle marks, the terror in her fever-bright eyes. This wasn't just a rescue, this was war. Stay with me until the end and comment your city below so I can see how far this story travels. The first shot cracked through the timber at sunset, and Jonah Cade's world tilted on its axis. He'd been mending fence line on the eastern pasture when the sound came rolling down from Ghost Mesa, a Winchester maybe 200 yards up the pine ridge. His hands stilled on the wire. For a long moment he stood frozen, the pliers hanging loose in his grip, every instinct from his old life screaming at him to move. But Jonah Cade didn't carry guns anymore. The second shot followed closer now, and he heard something else beneath it, hoofbeats frantic and uneven, crashing through deadfall. His jaw tightened. Not his business. Not anymore. He'd made a vow 10 years ago when he'd buried his badge and his Colt Peacemaker in a box beneath the barn floor. No more hunting, no more killing, just fence wire and cattle and the quiet redemption of honest work. The third shot shattered his resolve. It came from the clearing just beyond his property line, too close, too desperate. Jonah dropped the pliers and ran his boots pounding earth as the last light bled from the sky. His pulse hammered in his ears, mixing with sounds he'd tried to forget. Gunpowder, screaming horses, the wet finality of bodies hitting ground. When he broke through the tree line, the clearing opened before him like a wound. 3 bodies, 2 men sprawled in the dirt, their blood pooling black in the twilight. A third, a woman crumpled against a boulder, her dress torn, her face a mask of bruises. The horses were gone, scattered into the forest, and the silence that followed was so complete it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Jonah's boots crunched on spent shell casings as he approached. The woman's eyes flickered open, blue, fever-bright pupils blown wide with something that wasn't just fear. Please. Her voice was a rasp, barely human. Please, don't. He dropped to one knee, hands raised, palms out. Ma'am, I'm not going to hurt you. I'm Jonah Cade. I've got a ranch just over the ridge. She flinched anyway, her body curling inward like a wounded animal. When she spoke again, the words came in a broken whisper that would haunt him for weeks. I'm filthy, inside and out. You should just leave me. Something in Jonah's chest cracked open. He'd seen broken people before. Hell, he'd been the one to break some of them back when justice was a bounty and mercy was a luxury he couldn't afford. But this was different. This wasn't guilt or shame or the ordinary aftermath of violence. This was something deeper, something that had been carved into her soul piece by piece until she believed it was the truth. No, ma'am. His voice came out rougher than he intended. That's not how this works. He shrugged out of his duster the heavy canvas coat that had seen him through 100 cold nights on the trail. When he moved to drape it over her shoulders, she jerked back, a small animal sound escaping her throat. I won't touch you, he said quickly, stopping mid-motion. I'm just going to lay this here and you can pull it on when you're ready. All right. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the trap, the inevitable violence. When she found none, something shifted, not trust, not yet, but maybe the faint possibility of it. She reached out with trembling fingers and pulled the duster around herself, and Jonah felt his breath release in a rush he hadn't known he was holding. Can you walk? She shook her head, the movement sending a ripple of pain across her face. Up close now, he could see the full extent of it. The split lip, the bruising that wrapped around her throat like a necklace of fingerprints, the way her left arm hung at an odd angle. All right. Jonah stood, slowly scanning the clearing. The 2 dead men wore range clothes, nothing distinctive, but their gun rigs were too clean, too expensive for common drifters. Hired guns, then. The question was hired by whom. He needed to get her off this ridge, now. "I'm going to carry you to my place," he said, keeping his voice level and calm the way he'd talk to a spooked horse. "It's not far, maybe a quarter mile. I'll move slow, and if you need me to stop, you just say the word. Understood?" She nodded barely, and when he reached down, she didn't pull away. He slid one arm beneath her knees, the other supporting her back, careful not to jostle the injured arm. She weighed almost nothing, and beneath the duster he could feel the sharp angles of ribs, the hollow of starvation. The walk back to the ranch house stretched into eternity. Every step sent tremors through her body. Every breath she took sounded wet and ragged. Twice she whimpered, biting down on the sound like she was ashamed of her own pain. And twice Jonah stopped waiting until she could breathe again before continuing. By the time he kicked open his front door, full dark had fallen, and her skin was burning with fever. He laid her on his bed, the only bed in the single-room cabin, and stepped back immediately, giving her space. The lamp threw long shadows across the rough-hewn walls as he moved to the stove, stoking the fire, setting water to boil. His hands knew the motions from a lifetime of frontier living, but his mind was racing. Those men in the clearing hadn't been random road agents. They'd been hunting her specifically, and they'd been willing to kill to get her back, which meant there'd be more. There'd be people asking questions, and if they connected her to him... Jonah's jaw tightened. That was a problem for later. "Water," she rasped from the bed. He brought her the canteen, holding it steady, while she drank, careful not to let their fingers touch. When she'd had enough, she fell back against the pillow, her eyes already glazing with fever. "What's your name?" he asked quietly. For a long moment she didn't answer. Then, Clara Voss. The name meant nothing to him but the way she said it, like she was testing the shape of it in her mouth, like she wasn't sure it still belonged to her. That told him plenty. "Well, Miss Voss, I'm going to need to check those injuries. I won't..." "No." The word came sharp and final. "No touching." Jonah nodded slowly. "All right, but that fever's climbing, and if you've got internal bleeding or a broken bone set wrong, you're going to be in real trouble. I need you to at least let me see what we're working with." Her eyes found his, searching again for the trap. "You're not... You won't..." "No, ma'am, I won't." He pulled the only chair in the cabin over to the bedside and sat down deliberately, putting himself at her eye level instead of standing over her. "I'm going to sit right here while you check yourself. You tell me what hurts, where the blood's coming from, and we'll figure out what needs fixing." "All right." It took her 3 tries to sit up, and when she did, the duster fell away from her shoulders. Jonah kept his eyes on her face, waiting. Slowly, with movements that spoke of deep pain, she began to explore her own injuries. The ribs, the arm, the places where the dress was stiff with dried blood. "Ribs," she whispered finally. 3, maybe 4, left side. Arms not broken, just wrenched. And her voice caught. "And they..." "You don't have to say it." Jonah's voice was gentle but firm. "What I need to know is, are you bleeding anywhere that won't stop anything that needs stitching?" She shook her head, and relief flooded through him. "Good, that's good. Now those ribs, I'm going to need to wrap them, but I won't do it unless you say yes. I've got clean linen, and I can talk you through doing it yourself if you'd rather." Clara's hands were shaking too badly to manage it, and they both knew it. She closed her eyes, and he watched the war play out across her face. The need for help versus the terror of touch, survival versus shame. "You can..." The words came out strangled. "You can wrap them, but I need to see your hands the whole time." "You'll see them," Jonah promised. He moved with deliberate slowness, showing her each strip of linen before he brought it close, narrating every motion. "I'm going to reach around your back now, not touching skin, just the fabric. You'll feel the linen pull snug but not tight. If it's too much, you say stop." Her breathing came in short, panicked gasps, but she nodded. Jonah worked with the careful precision of a man defusing a bomb, each wrap of the linen another small victory against the demons in her head. When it was done, she sagged forward exhausted, and he caught her shoulders, just enough to ease her back against the pillows. "There, done. You did good, Miss Voss." She didn't respond, her eyes already starting to close. The fever was climbing higher, and Jonah knew the next few hours would be critical. He dampened a cloth in the cool water and laid it across her forehead, then sat back in the chair. That's when he saw them. Her sleeve had ridden up during the wrapping, exposing her forearm. In the lamplight, the marks were unmistakable rope burns, fresh and angry, circling her wrists like shackles, and beneath them, older marks, needle punctures scattered across the crook of her elbow in a pattern that spoke of repeated, deliberate injection. Jonah's blood ran cold. This wasn't a road attack. This wasn't even a simple abduction. This was systematic, professional, the kind of operation that required resources, connections, and a complete absence of conscience. He stood abruptly, crossing to the window. Outside, the night pressed close, and somewhere out there, men were looking for her. Men who'd left her for dead once already and wouldn't make that mistake twice. The decision crystallized in his mind like ice. He could turn her over to the sheriff in redemption, let the law sort it out. Clean, simple, not his problem, or he could stay. Jonah looked back at the woman on his bed, Clara Voss, who believed she was filthy, who'd been used and broken and discarded like trash, who was still fighting, still breathing, still trying to survive against odds that would have crushed most men. He walked to the corner where he kept his tools and pulled up the loose floorboard. The box was still there, dust-covered and forgotten. Inside, his old Colt Peacemaker, his badge, and the leather roll of bounty notices from a life he'd sworn to leave behind. Jonah lifted the Peacemaker, felt the familiar weight of it in his palm. 10 years. 10 years of peace, of fence posts and cattle, of trying to be something other than the hunter he'd been born to be. He checked the cylinder, still loaded, still ready, and slipped the gun into his belt. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the vow he was breaking, "but not for this." The night deepened, and Jonah settled into the chair by the door, rifle across his knees, watching Clara's fever dreams twist her face into masks of terror. Every hour he changed the cool cloth on her forehead. Every hour he checked the windows for movement in the darkness beyond. Around midnight, she started talking in her sleep, fragments of memory, pieces of horror. "No more, please, no more. The children. God, the children are in the cellar." Jonah leaned forward, every nerve alert. Clara, what children? But she was lost in the fever dream, unreachable. Her hands clawed at the blankets, and her voice rose to a thin wail. "Judge Monroe knows. Garrick is coming. He's coming for all of us." Judge Monroe. The name hit Jonah like a fist to the gut. Archibald Monroe, the federal judge who'd brought law and order to the New Mexico territory, who'd hanged outlaws and freed the innocent, who had a reputation so clean it practically gleamed. If Monroe was involved in this. A sound outside froze Jonah's thoughts. The soft whicker of a horse quickly silenced. He moved to the window, careful to stay in shadow. There, at the edge of the tree line, 2 riders sat watching his cabin. They made no move to approach, just observed, patient as death. They knew she was here. Jonah's hand found the Peacemaker's grip. He could fight. He'd fought before, won against worse odds. But that would mean gunfire, and gunfire would bring more trouble, and trouble would bring the kind of attention that would get Clara killed. So instead, he watched them watching him, and he waited. An hour before dawn, the riders melted back into the forest. Jonah didn't relax. They'd be back, and next time they'd bring friends. Behind him, Clara stirred. Her eyes opened clearer now, the fever broken for the moment. She looked around the cabin, taking in the rough walls, the simple furniture, the man with the rifle sitting guard by the door. "You stayed," she whispered. "I stayed." Why? Jonah met her gaze across the dim room, and for the first time in 10 years, he felt the old purpose rising in his chest, not the hunger for the hunt, but something cleaner, something that might actually be worth dying for. Because you were right, he said quietly, about being filthy. Her face crumpled and he saw the shame wash over her again. No, listen to me. He leaned forward, urgent now. You were right that there's filth here, but it's not in you, Miss Voss. It's in whatever they did to you. It's in the men who hurt you. It's in the system that let it happen, and I'll be damned if I let that filth win. Clara stared at him, tears tracking down her bruised cheeks. You don't know what they'll do to you, what they're capable of. Then tell me. She opened her mouth, closed, it opened it again. The words seemed to cost her everything. There are children somewhere being sold like cattle. I was supposed to. They wanted me to. She broke off, shaking. Judge Monroe signs the papers, makes it legal. Garrick moves them, and I was stupid enough to try to stop it. The cabin seemed to shrink around them, the weight of her revelation pressing down like a physical thing. Children, a trafficking ring, a federal judge. This wasn't just big. This was a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of territorial power. How many? Jonah asked, his voice deadly calm. I don't know. Dozens, maybe. They kept ledgers. Names, prices, routes. It was industrialized. Efficient. She laughed, a broken sound. They were so proud of how well organized it was. Jonah stood slowly, his mind already working through the implications. If Monroe was involved, then the law in redemption was compromised. The sheriff, the deputies, anyone could be on the judge's payroll. Going to the authorities was suicide. But there had to be someone, some authority beyond Monroe's reach. There's a pastor in town, Jonah said, thinking out loud. Elias Boone used to be cavalry, served in the Apache campaigns. He's the only man I know who doesn't owe Monroe anything. Clara's eyes widened. You're going to tell him. We're going to tell him, together, but not yet. Jonah moved to the window, scanning the dawn-lit forest. First, we need to get you strong enough to ride, and second, we need to disappear before those watchers come back with reinforcements. They won't stop, Clara said quietly. Garrick doesn't fail. Monroe doesn't leave witnesses. Good. Jonah's smile was cold and hard, the expression of a man who'd once made his living hunting the worst of humanity. Neither do I. He turned back to her, and in his eyes she saw something that made her breath catch. Not pity, not disgust, but recognition. He saw her, not the broken thing she'd been made into, but the fighter who'd survived, the woman who'd tried to save children at the cost of her own life. Rest now, he said. We move at nightfall. Clara nodded and closed her eyes, but for the first time since the clearing, something other than fear moved through her chest. It was fragile, barely there, but unmistakable hope. Outside, the sun broke over Ghost Mesa, painting the territory in shades of gold and blood. Somewhere in redemption, Judge Monroe was waking to morning coffee, secure in his power, confident in his control. He didn't know it yet, but his empire was already crumbling, because Jonah Cade had just gone back to war, and this time it was personal. The canyon walls rose like cathedral spires on either side of them, swallowing the moonlight and leaving only shadows. Clara's hands gripped the saddle horn until her knuckles turned white, every jolt of the horse's gait sending fire through her wrapped ribs. Behind them, somewhere in the darkness, the trackers were closing in. Jonah rode ahead, his silhouette barely visible against the star-pricked sky. He'd been silent since they'd fled the ranch 2 hours ago, his attention fixed on the trail with an intensity that made Clara's skin prickle. This wasn't the gentle rancher who'd wrapped her ribs with shaking hands. This was someone else entirely, someone who moved through the wilderness like a ghost, reading signs in the darkness that she couldn't even see. A stone clattered somewhere behind them, and Jonah's hand shot up in a signal to stop. Clara pulled her horse to a halt, her heart hammering so loud she was sure it would give them away. The canyon held its breath. Then faint but unmistakable voices, men's voices, drifting down from the ridge above. They split up, one called out. Garrick wants the woman alive, but the rancher's fair game. Monroe says, make it clean, no bodies to find. Jonah turned in his saddle, his eyes finding Clara's in the darkness. He pressed a finger to his lips, then pointed down a narrow cut between the rocks, barely wide enough for a horse. Clara nodded understanding. They'd have to go single file, and if the trackers spotted them in that choke point, they'd be slaughtered like animals in a pen. But they had no choice. Jonah dismounted, leading his horse into the gap. Clara followed, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. The walls pressed close so tight her stirrups scraped stone on both sides. Above, the voices grew louder, and she heard the distinctive sound of rifles being cocked. Their movement in the side canyon. Gunfire erupted, muzzle flashes lighting up the night like lightning. Bullets screamed off the rock walls, ricocheting in wild patterns. Clara's horse reared, nearly throwing her, and she felt Jonah's hand close around her arm, steady, strong, pulling her forward, even as the world exploded into chaos around them. "Don't stop," he shouted over the gunfire. "Whatever happens, don't stop." They burst out of the narrow passage into a wider section of the canyon, and Jonah was already swinging back into his saddle. "Ride due west, follow the canyon floor." "What about you?" "I'm buying us time, go." Before Clara could protest, he'd wheeled his horse around and was charging back toward the gap, his peacemaker drawn, his face set in grim determination. She heard him fire twice, heard a man scream, heard the sound of horses scrambling on loose rock. Then Jonah was beside her again, his horse lathered with sweat, and they were racing through the darkness like the devil himself was on their heels. Because he was. They rode hard for another hour before Jonah finally slowed, guiding them off the canyon floor and up a treacherous switchback trail that climbed the eastern wall. Clara's vision swam with exhaustion and pain, but she followed, trusting him because she had no other choice. At the top, Jonah led them into a cluster of boulders and dismounted. "We rest here, 2 hours, no more." Clara slid from her saddle and immediately collapsed her legs, refusing to hold her weight. Jonah caught her before she hit the ground, lowering her gently against a smooth rock face. For a moment his hands lingered on her shoulders, and she felt the warmth of them through her torn dress, not threatening, not claiming, just steadying. "You did good back there," he said quietly. "Most people would have frozen. Most people haven't been through what I have." The words came out harder than she'd intended. "Fear's just another kind of prison. You learn to move through it or die." Jonah studied her face in the starlight, and she saw something shift in his expression. Respect maybe, or recognition. "How long were you with them?" Clara's throat tightened. 3 months, maybe 4. They kept me foggy, drugs to keep me compliant. She touched the needle marks on her arm unconsciously. I started hiding the doses, pretending to swallow. It took weeks before I could think clearly enough to plan. "Is that when you found out about the children?" The question drove the air from her lungs. "I was supposed to be one of them at first. They took me in Chicago. I was a governess for a wealthy family. Garrick posed as a potential employer, said he needed someone to care for his nieces out west." She laughed bitterly. "I was so stupid, so eager for the adventure." "That's not stupid, that's hope." Jonah settled against the rock beside her, careful to maintain distance. "What changed? Why weren't you sold with the others?" Clara's hands clenched into fists. "Monroe saw me. At one of the processing stations, that's what they called them. He decided I was too old for the usual buyers, but too refined to waste. So he gave me to the Calhoun mansion as a gift. Told them I'd train the merchandise, make the children more valuable." The rage that flashed across Jonah's face was swift and terrible. "And you refused." "I tried to get them out. There was a cellar beneath the carriage house, 12 children, all under 10, kept in cages like animals. I managed to pick the lock one night, got 6 of them to the back gate before the guards found us." Her voice cracked. "They beat me unconscious. When I woke up, the children were gone, shipped out. and I was being dragged to the woods to be eliminated. But you escaped. They got careless, thought 3 men were enough to handle 1 drugged woman. Clara's smile was sharp as a knife. I got the gun away from the youngest one, shot him, then the driver. The 3rd one, she stopped, the memory still fresh and bloody. The 3rd one I killed with his own knife. Jonah didn't flinch, didn't judge. Good. The simple affirmation did something to Clara's carefully constructed walls. She felt them crack just a little, just enough to let the weight of it all press down on her chest until she couldn't breathe. I should have done more, she whispered. I should have gotten them all out. Those children are still out there being sold, Her voice broke completely. What kind of person fails at that? The kind who's human. Jonah's voice was gentle but firm. You tried. Against impossible odds, you tried. That's more than most people ever do. It wasn't enough. Not yet, maybe, but it will be. He shifted, and she heard the leather of his gun belt creak. I'm going to teach you something that might help even the odds next time. Clara looked up surprised. What? How to move silent, how to track, how to shoot straight enough to stop a man without killing him if that's what you choose. His eyes met hers, steady and serious. I spent 10 years hunting the worst of humanity, Miss Voss. I know how they think, how they move, how they make mistakes. And if we're going to bring down Monroe and Garrick, you need to stop being a victim and become a weapon. The word hung between them, weapon. Not survivor, not witness weapon. Something dangerous. Something that could strike back. Yes, Clara breathed. Teach me. They started that night there in the boulder field under a sky full of cold stars. Jonah showed her how to move her feet to avoid snapping twigs, how to control her breathing to stay quiet, how to use the natural sound of wind and water to mask her approach. His instruction was patient but exacting, and every time she made a mistake, he made her repeat the movement until her body remembered it without thought. Good, he said when she managed to cross 20 feet of loose rock without making a sound. Now the hard part. He drew his peacemaker and handed it to her grip first. The weight of it shocked her, so much heavier than she'd expected, the metal cold against her palm. I don't know if I can, she started, but Jonah cut her off. You already have. You killed 2 men to escape. This is just making sure you can do it again when it counts. He positioned himself behind her, not touching, but close enough that she could feel the heat of him. See that dead tree 30 yards out? Put the sight on the fork where the trunk splits. Clara raised the gun, her arms trembling with effort. The sight wavered, dancing around the target like a drunken bee. Breathe, Jonah murmured. In through your nose, out through your mouth. Let half the air out and hold. Between heartbeats, that's when you squeeze. She tried. The gun bucked in her hand, the report echoing off the canyon walls like thunder. The bullet went wide, kicking up dust 10 feet to the left of the tree. Again. They worked until the sky began to pale in the east, until Clara's arms burned and her ears rang from the gunfire. By the time Jonah called a halt, she could hit the tree trunk 3 times out of 5, and the peacemaker no longer felt like a foreign object in her grip. We need to move, Jonah said, checking their back trail. Sun's coming up, and they'll be able to track us once there's light. But as they mounted their horses, Clara felt different, not healed, not whole, but harder, somehow, less breakable. She was learning the language of violence, and with each lesson the shame that had wrapped around her, like chains, loosened just a little. They rode through the morning, following game trails and dry washes that left minimal sign. Jonah kept them moving in a seemingly random pattern, doubling back, crossing streams, circling through boulder fields until Clara was completely disoriented. But she trusted him, trusted the way he read the land, the way his eyes constantly scanned for danger. Around midday, they stopped at a spring hidden in a grove of cottonwoods. While the horses drank, Jonah pulled out a piece of hardtack and broke it in half, offering Clara the larger portion. You need to eat. Keep your strength up. She took it, forcing herself to chew and swallow, even though her stomach rebelled. Where are we going? Redemption's too dangerous now, but there's a woman there. Martha Chen runs the apothecary. If anyone can help us, it's her. Won't they be watching the town? They'll be watching the roads. We're not taking roads. Jonah's expression was grim. But first, I need you to tell me everything you remember about that mansion, the layout, the guards, where they kept the ledgers. Clara closed her eyes, forcing herself back into the nightmare. The main house is 3 stories brick. Servants' entrance in the rear. The Calhouns sleep on the 3rd floor. They don't know what's happening in their own cellar, or they don't care to know. Garrick has an office in the east wing, 1st floor. That's where I saw the ledgers. Guard patterns. 2 men on the front gate changed every 6 hours. Roving patrol in the gardens after dark. And she stopped, a memory surfacing like a corpse from deep water. And there's a dog, a mastiff. Garrick keeps it hungry. Jonah nodded, filing away each detail. What about Monroe? Where does he fit in? He visits every Tuesday, signs documents in Garrick's office. Adoption papers, they call them. Legal transfers of custody. Her hands clenched. He makes it all legitimate. Children disappear from orphanages, from poor families, from the streets, and Monroe's signature turns kidnapping into legal guardianship. The buyers get clean paperwork. No one asks questions. And the roots, where do they take the children? Clara's breath hitched. I only saw fragments, cities back east, San Francisco. 1 shipment was headed to Mexico City. They have contacts everywhere, politicians, judges, wealthy buyers, who pay in gold. The scope of it settled over them like a suffocating blanket. This wasn't just a local operation. This was a network that spanned territories, states, maybe even countries. And they were 2 people, 1 broken woman and 1 retired bounty hunter trying to bring it down. We're going to need help, Jonah said finally. More than just Pastor Boone, who... Before Jonah could answer, his horse's ears pricked forward and he was on his feet in an instant, rifle raised. Clara grabbed the peacemaker, her heart slamming into her throat. The sound came again, hoofbeats approaching fast from the south. Into the trees, Jonah hissed. Now. They led the horses deeper into the cottonwood grove, pressing against the trunks as the riders came into view. 3 men moving at a hard gallop, their faces grim with purpose. Clara recognized the lead rider immediately, Garrick's second-in-command, a brutal enforcer named Dulane. They're heading for the spring, she breathed. Then we go quiet, and we go now. Jonah's hand found hers in the shadows, a brief squeeze of reassurance. Follow my lead. Step where I step. They moved like ghosts through the undergrowth, every footfall carefully placed, every breath controlled. Behind them, the riders reached the spring, and Clara heard Dulane's voice ring out. Fresh tracks. They were here within the hour. Spread out, search the tree line. Jonah pulled Clara down behind a fallen log, his body a shield between her and the hunters. They could hear the men dismounting, hear the jingle of spurs and the metallic click of rifles being readied. The sound grew closer, and Clara's finger tightened on the peacemaker's trigger. A boot crunched through leaves not 10 feet from their hiding spot. Then another. Through a gap in the log, Clara could see the man's legs, could see the rifle barrel sweeping left and right. Jonah's hand moved to his knife, and Clara understood. If the man found them, Jonah would have to kill him. Silently, brutally. And then they'd have to kill the other 2 before anyone could raise an alarm. The man stopped, turned. His shadow fell across the log. And then from somewhere to the east, a hawk screamed. The man's head snapped toward the sound, and he moved away, drawn by the noise. Jonah let out a breath so quiet Clara almost missed it, and they waited frozen as the searchers gradually moved farther from their position. Nothing here, Dulane, one of the men called out. Keep looking. Monroe wants them found today. But the search was perfunctory now. The men, clearly convinced their quarry had moved on. After another 10 minutes, they remounted and rode north, following false trails that would lead them in circles. When the sound of hoofbeats faded completely, Jonah finally moved. Come on, we need distance. They emerged from the grove and mounted up, But this time Jonah angled them southeast, away from redemption, away from anything Clara recognized. Where? Trust me. And she did. God help her, she did. They rode through the heat of the afternoon, the sun beating down like a hammer. Clara's fever was returning. She could feel it building behind her eyes, turning the world soft at the edges. But she stayed in the saddle, gripping tight to consciousness, because falling now meant death. As the sun began its descent, they crested a rise, and redemption spread out before them in the valley below. The town looked peaceful in the golden light church spire rising above false-fronted buildings, smoke from cook fires drifting into the sky. It looked like civilization, like safety. Clara knew better. "We'll wait until full dark," Jonah said, studying the town through narrowed eyes. "Then we go in quiet, get to Martha's, and get out before anyone knows we're there. And if someone sees us," his jaw tightened, "then we run. Again." They made camp in a hollow just below the ridgeline. No fire, just cold jerky and water from Jonah's canteen. As twilight deepened, Clara felt the fever climbing higher, and with it came the memories, flashes of the cellar, the children's faces, Garrick's cold smile as he explained how profitable she could be if she just cooperated. "Hey," Jonah's voice cut through the memories. "Stay with me. I need you present. I'm trying." But her voice sounded distant, even to her own ears. "Jonah, if I don't make it, you're making it. Listen to me." She grabbed his arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. "If I don't make it, you need to know there's a ledger, a master copy. Garrick keeps it in a safe behind a painting in his office. The combination is 14 to 27, 33. That's the proof you need. Names, dates, transactions, everything." Jonah's eyes locked onto hers, fierce and determined. "You're going to tell Martha yourself. You're going to walk into that apothecary and you're going to help us bring these bastards down." Understood. Clara wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that she had a future beyond the next few hours. But the fever was burning that hope away, leaving only the cold certainty that she was dying, that her body had taken too much damage, that even if they reached Martha, it might be too late. "Promise me something," she whispered. "Anything. The children, if I die, you save them. You don't stop until every last one is free." Jonah's hand covered hers, warm and solid. "I promise. But you're going to be there to see it. Now come on, we've got work to do." He pulled her to her feet as the last light died, and they began the careful descent toward redemption. The town was settling in for the night, lamplight glowing in windows, the saloon's tinny piano music drifting on the evening breeze. They circled wide, avoiding Main Street, sticking to the alleys and backlots where shadows pooled deep. Martha Chen's apothecary sat on a side street, a modest building with clean windows and a painted sign. Jonah approached from the rear, checking carefully for watchers, before tapping a specific rhythm on the back door. It opened a crack and a woman's face appeared, Chinese, middle-aged, with eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes widened when she saw Jonah, then narrowed with concern when she saw Clara. "Inside, quickly!" They slipped through the door into a back room that smelled of herbs and antiseptic. Martha closed the door and threw the bolt, then turned to face them with her arms crossed. "Jonah Cade, you've got about 30 seconds to explain why half of Garrick's men are tearing up the countryside looking for you. Because I found something they want back." Jonah guided Clara to a chair, and she collapsed into it gratefully. "Martha, this is Clara Voss. I know who she is." Martha moved closer, her professional gaze cataloging Clara's injuries with swift efficiency. "The missing governess from Chicago. They had notices posted for weeks. Said she'd been kidnapped by road bandits." Her eyes met Clara's. "But that's not the truth, is it?" "No." Clara's voice came out as a rasp. "The truth is much worse." And then while Martha worked cleaning wounds, checking for infection, preparing tinctures, Clara told her everything. The mansion, the cellar, the children, the ledgers. Monroe's involvement, Garrick's network, the industrialized horror of it all. Martha's hands never stopped moving, but her face grew harder with each revelation. When Clara finished, the apothecary stood silent for a long moment, her jaw working. "I believe you," she said finally. "Not just because Jonah vouches for you, but because I've seen the signs. Children who disappear from the orphanage, families who lose daughters and are told not to ask questions. I thought I was imagining connections where there were none, but—" She shook her head. "I should have pushed harder." "You couldn't have known," Jonah said. "I should have." Martha's expression was grim. "But I know now. What do you need? Information, resources, and a way to get Clara somewhere safe while we figure out our next move." Martha turned to Clara, studying her with those sharp eyes. "You're burning up with fever. Those ribs aren't healing right. You need at least a week of rest, probably more." "I don't have a week." Clara forced herself to sit up straighter despite the pain. "Those children don't have a week." "Stubborn." Martha's mouth quirked in something that might have been approval. "You'll fit right in, but if you push too hard, too fast, you'll be useless to everyone, including those children." Before Clara could protest, the front door rattled. All three of them froze. The rattle came again, followed by a heavy fist pounding on the wood. "Martha Chen, open up sheriff's orders." Martha's eyes met Jonah's, and some silent communication passed between them. She moved to the front room, calling out, "One moment, I'm not decent." Jonah was already pulling Clara toward a door on the far wall. "Storage cellar. Go." "Jonah, I'll handle this. Go." Clara stumbled down the narrow stairs into darkness just as she heard Martha open the front door. Male voices, rough and demanding. She pressed herself into the corner behind shelves of supplies, one hand on the peacemaker, trying to control her ragged breathing. Above, boots stomped across floorboards. "We're looking for a woman. Injured, probably seeking medical help. You seen anyone like that?" "Half the town comes through here with injuries," Martha replied coolly. "You'll need to be more specific." "Clara Voss. She's wanted for murder. Shot 2 of Garrick's men in cold blood." Clara's hand tightened on the gun. So that was the story they were spinning. Make her the criminal, justify the manhunt. "Haven't seen her." Martha's voice remained steady. "But if she's injured and dangerous, perhaps you should check with Doc Stevens. He handles the serious cases." "We're checking everywhere." The voice moved closer and Clara heard a door open the back room. "What's this? Fresh bandages, blood on the floor." "I had a patient earlier. Mining accident. Nothing to do with your manhunt." "We'll be the judge of that." Boots descended the cellar stairs. Clara pressed herself deeper into shadow, the peacemaker coming up. She could see the lamplight now, could see the dark shape of a man's head and shoulders as he ducked into the cellar. If he turned, if he saw her, she'd have to shoot. And then Martha would be implicated, dragged down with her. The man took another step, his lamp held high, the light pushing toward her hiding spot. Clara's finger tightened on the trigger, every muscle coiled to spring. Then Jonah's voice rang out from upstairs. "That'll be enough, deputy." The man in the cellar hesitated. "Who the hell are you?" "Jonah Cade. This is my property you're trampling. Martha leases this building from me. So we've got authority to search wherever we need to search. You've got authority to search with probable cause and a warrant. I see neither." Jonah's tone was ice cold. "Now get out before I file a complaint with the territorial court." There was a tense moment. Clara could feel it even from her hiding place, when the balance could have tipped either way. Then the deputy grunted and climbed back up the stairs, his boots heavy with frustration. "This ain't over. Garrick's going to hear about this obstruction." "I'm sure he will. Doors that way." More boot stomps, then the front door slamming, silence stretching out like a held breath. Finally, Martha's voice, "They're gone." Clara emerged from the cellar on shaking legs. Jonah was at the window watching the street, and Martha was already throwing supplies into a canvas bag, bandages, medicines, dried herbs. "You can't stay here," Martha said briskly. "They'll be back with more men, maybe even Monroe himself." "Where do we go?" Clara asked, even though she already knew the answer. Nowhere was safe. Martha paused, a strange look crossing her face. Then she reached into her apron and pulled out a folded newspaper, weeks old, the edges torn. She spread it on the counter, and Clara saw her own face staring back at her, A photograph from Chicago when she'd been whole and hopeful and naive. "Governess missing," the headline screamed. "Reward offered." But it was the smaller article below that made Clara's blood run cold. "Judge Monroe oversees successful adoption program. Dozens of orphans find new homes through territorial initiative." The date on the article was 3 days ago. "He's still doing it," Clara whispered, shocked. "Even with me missing, even with the risk, he's still moving children." Jonah leaned over the newspaper, his face carved from stone. "Where's the next shipment?" Martha pointed to a detail in the article. The latest group of fortunate children departed from the Redemption Way station yesterday, bound for loving families in California. Yesterday, Jonah straightened, which means they're still on the road, still catchable. "Are you insane?" Martha grabbed his arm. "You can't intercept a transport. They'll have guards, outriders, probably a dozen armed men. Then we'll need a plan." Jonah turned to Clara, and she saw the old hunter rising behind his eyes, calculating, ruthless, focused. How many children per shipment? Clara's mind raced back through fragmented memories. Usually 6 to 8. Depends on the orders. They travel in a sealed coach guards, riding alongside. They take the southern route through the canyon, less traffic, fewer witnesses. "I know that route. There's a narrow section about 2 days' ride from here, steep walls on both sides." Jonah's hands moved like he was already seeing the terrain. "We could set up a blockade, force them to stop." "And then what?" Martha's voice was sharp with fear. "You're 2 people against a dozen. It's suicide." "Not if we're smart about it." Jonah met her eyes. "Not if we have help." Martha was quiet for a long moment. Then she sighed, the sound of a woman stepping over a line she could never uncross. "There's a man. Samuel Weathers runs the livery. His daughter disappeared 2 years ago, 14 years old, vanished on her way home from school. The sheriff said she ran off, but Samuel never believed it." Understanding dawned on Clara's face. She was taken. "If I had to guess, yes. And if we tell Samuel the truth, show him there's a chance to stop it from happening to others." Martha spread her hands. "He'll help. I know he will." Jonah nodded slowly. "Anyone else? Half the town if we could tell them the truth. But the other half belongs to Monroe, and we don't know which is which." Martha's expression was grim. "You're going to have to move fast and trust carefully." A sound outside made them all freeze, horses, several of them pulling to a stop in front of the apothecary. Clara moved to the window and felt her heart stop. Garrick himself sat astride a black stallion, his elegant clothes pristine despite the day's hunt. Behind him 6 riders, hard men with harder eyes. And beside him, mounted on a gray mare, was Judge Archibald Monroe, his silver hair gleaming in the lamplight. "They know," Clara breathed. "They know we're here." Jonah was already moving, grabbing the supply bag, pulling Clara toward the back door. But before they reached it, Martha caught his arm. "Wait, there's another way." She crossed to a corner of the room and pulled back a rag rug, revealing a trapdoor. "Tunnel, built it during the Apache troubles, comes out in the livery in Samuel's stable." "Martha, go, I'll stall them." She was already straightening her apron, her face settling into a mask of innocent confusion. "If Samuel's there, tell him I sent you. If he's not—" She pressed a key into Jonah's hand. "Third stall from the left. My horse. She knows the canyon trail." Clara grabbed Martha's hand, squeezing hard. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just stop them. Stop all of it." Martha's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Give those children a chance." The pounding on the front door started as Jonah and Clara dropped into the tunnel. It was narrow, barely wide enough for shoulders, the earthen walls held back by ancient timbers that creaked ominously. Clara had to bend nearly double to move through it, each step an agony on her ribs, but Jonah pulled her forward relentlessly. Behind them, muffled by earth, they heard Martha open the door, heard Garrick's smooth voice. "Good evening, Miss Chen. We're looking for a friend of mine. I believe she may have sought your services." They couldn't hear Martha's response, but they didn't need to. They just kept moving, crawling through darkness until finally Jonah's hand found a ladder. Up they climbed, emerging into the sweet-smelling darkness of the livery stable. A lamp flared to life, and Samuel Weathers stood there, an older black man with calloused hands and eyes full of old grief. He looked at them for a long moment, taking in Clara's injuries, Jonah's grim expression, the desperation that clung to them like a second skin. "Martha sent you," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Jonah helped Clara to her feet. "And we need your help." Samuel set down the lamp and crossed his arms. "You're the ones they're hunting. The ones who've got Monroe and Garrick stirred up like hornets." "We are." "Why?" Jonah glanced at Clara, and she understood this was her story to tell, her truth to share. She stepped forward, ignoring the pain, ignoring the fever, and looked Samuel Weathers straight in the eye. "Because they took your daughter, Mr. Weathers, and they've taken hundreds more, and if we don't stop them, they'll keep taking until there's no one left to save." The old man's face crumpled just for a moment, grief and rage and terrible hope warring across his features. "You know what happened to Sarah." "I don't know what happened to your Sarah specifically, but I know the system that took her. I know the men who run it. I know where the ledgers are kept, the records that might tell us where she is." Clara's voice broke. "And I swear to you, on everything I have left, we're going to burn that system to the ground." Samuel stared at her, and she saw him making the same choice Jonah had made, the same choice Martha had made, the choice to step into the fire because the alternative was living with the ash. "What do you need?" he asked finally. "Horses, supplies, and your silence for 48 hours. You'll have it." He moved to the tack room, already pulling down saddles. "But after that, if you haven't come back, I'm coming after you, and I'm bringing everyone in this town who's lost someone. Monroe and Garrick won't know what hit them." They worked quickly, saddling Martha's horse and a sturdy gelding Samuel offered. The old man packed their saddlebags with efficiency born of long experience, food, water, ammunition, even a spare rifle. As he worked, he spoke quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "Sarah was my only child. After she vanished, my wife, she couldn't bear it. Died of grief within the year. I've spent every day since wondering if I could have done more, seen it coming, protected her somehow." He looked up, his eyes meeting Clara's. "If there's even a chance of finding her, of stopping this, I'll die for that chance." "You might have to," Jonah said bluntly. "If Monroe finds out you helped us, let him find out." Samuel's jaw set hard. "I've been dead inside for 2 years. At least this way, it'll mean something." They were ready to mount when Clara heard voices from the street moving toward the livery. Garrick's voice, smooth as poison. "Check the stables. They couldn't have gotten far." Samuel moved fast, shoving them toward the back door. "There's a trail behind the building, follows the creek bed north. Stay in the water, it'll hide your scent and your tracks. 3 miles up, you'll find an old line shack. Hide there until dawn." "Samuel," Clara started. "Go, I'll deal with them." They went slipping out into the night just as the livery's front door burst open. Clara heard Garrick's voice, heard Samuel's calm response, heard the sounds of a search beginning, but they were already moving, already splashing through the cold creek water, already disappearing into the wilderness like ghosts. They ran until Clara's lungs burned and her vision tunneled. They ran until her legs gave out and Jonah had to catch her, had to half carry her the last mile to the line shack. And when they finally collapsed inside that decrepit shelter, when her body finally surrendered to the fever and the exhaustion, her last conscious thought was of children in cages and a ledger that held all the answers. Jonah held her as she fell into darkness, his voice a distant anchor. I've got you, just hold on." But even unconscious, even burning with fever, Clara's hand remained locked around the peacemaker, because this wasn't over, this was just beginning. Dawn came too soon, painting the line shack's cracked walls in shades of copper and gold. Clara woke to the sound of Jonah moving quietly near the cold stove, his back to her, his shoulders tight with tension. The fever had broken sometime in the night, leaving her wrung out, but clear-headed for the first time in days. How long was I out? Her voice came as a croak. Jonah turned relief flashing across his face before he schooled it back to neutral. 6 hours. How do you feel? Like I've been trampled by a horse and left for dead. She pushed herself up to sitting, ignoring the protests from her ribs. But I can ride. We need to move. Not yet. Jonah crossed to her with a canteen and some jerky from their supplies. Samuel bought us time, but it won't last. They'll figure out we went north, and when they do, they'll come hard and fast. Clara took the canteen, drinking slowly, despite her body's demand to gulp it down. Then we need to be somewhere else when they arrive. To transport the children, how long do we have? If they left Redemption yesterday morning like the paper said, they're already a day ahead of us. Moving at transport speed with a heavy coach, they'll reach the canyon narrows by tomorrow afternoon. Jonah's jaw tightened. We've got maybe 30 hours to get there, first set up, and figure out how to stop them without getting those children killed. 30 hours? Clara's laugh was bitter. Against how many guards? At least 8, probably more. Garrick doesn't take chances with valuable cargo. He watched her carefully. This is suicide, Clara.
You know that, right? Even if we manage to free the children, even if we survive the fight, Monroe will hunt us to the ends of the earth.
I know. She met his eyes steadily. I also know that if we don't try, those children disappear forever. And I've seen where they disappear to Jonah. I've seen the buyers, the families who purchase them like livestock. Death is kinder than that fate. Something shifted in Jonah's expression, respect mixed with sorrow. You're going to make me break every vow I ever made, aren't you? Only the ones that don't matter anymore. They packed in silence, each movement economical and purposeful. Clara's body screamed at her to rest, to surrender to the damage that had been done, but she pushed through it. The children didn't have time for her weakness. Sarah Weathers didn't have time. All those nameless, faceless victims being loaded into coaches and shipped like cargo, they didn't have time. The trail north from the line shack was barely visible, more animal track than road, but it kept them off the main routes, where Garrick's men would be searching. They rode hard, stopping only to rest the horses, pushing toward the canyon with grim determination. Around midday, they crested a ridge, and Jonah pulled up short. Clara followed his gaze and felt her stomach drop. Below them, moving along the valley road like ants, was a line of riders, at least a dozen men spread out in a search pattern, methodically checking every ravine and hollow. They're between us and the canyon, Clara breathed. Not for long. Jonah's eyes were calculating measuring distances and angles. We go west, circle around through the high country. It'll add hours to our journey, but we'll come at the canyon from the other side, where they won't expect us. Can we make it in time? We have to. They veered west, climbing into terrain so rugged, Clara wondered if they'd break the horses' legs on the treacherous footing. But Jonah navigated it with the sureness of a man who'd spent years reading land, like other men read books, finding paths where none seemed to exist. The afternoon wore on, the sun beating down mercilessly. Clara's fever tried to return, sending waves of heat and cold through her body, but she gritted her teeth and stayed in the saddle. Jonah watched her with growing concern, but he didn't slow their pace. They both knew what was at stake. As the sun began its descent, they finally emerged onto a high plateau overlooking a massive canyon system. Jonah dismounted and pulled out a battered spyglass, scanning the terrain below. There, he handed Clara the glass, pointing. See that section where the walls narrow? That's our spot. Clara peered through the spyglass and saw what he meant, a bottleneck in the canyon barely wide enough for a single coach, with sheer walls rising on both sides. A perfect trap if you were the one springing it. A perfect killing ground if you weren't. How do we stop them without starting a war in front of the children? She asked, lowering the glass. Jonah was quiet for a long moment, his mind clearly working through scenarios. We don't stop them in the narrows. We stop them before they get there. Force them to pull up, create confusion, separate the guards from the coach. And how do we do that?
A grim smile touched his lips. "We make them think there's been a collapse. Block the road with enough debris that they have to stop and clear it. While they're distracted, you get to the coach." Clara's heart kicked against her ribs. "Me, you're the only one the children might trust. They've been taught to fear men, to see them as either buyers or guards. But a woman, especially one who's clearly been hurt, who speaks gently, they might listen." His eyes met hers. "I'll handle the guards. You handle the rescue." The plan was insane, suicidal, built on a foundation of hope so fragile a strong wind could shatter it, but it was also the only chance those children had. "All right," Clara said, "let's do it." They descended to the canyon as twilight thickened, leading the horses carefully down switchbacks that seemed to crumble under their weight. At the bottom, Jonah found what he was looking for, a section where the canyon wall showed signs of previous rockfalls, where the stone was fractured and unstable. "We'll need to work through the night," he said, studying the wall. "Create a believable collapse, stage it so it looks natural. If they suspect a trap, they'll be on high alert." Clara looked at the wall, at the massive boulders balanced precariously above, and felt doubt creep in. Can we even move rocks that size? We don't move them. We encourage them to move themselves. Jonah was already unpacking rope from his saddlebag, his hands working with practiced efficiency. Leverage, physics, and a little bit of faith. They worked through the night, and Clara discovered muscles she'd forgotten existed, using fallen logs as levers, rope as pulleys, and sheer desperate strength. They coaxed boulders from their resting places, let them tumble and crash into the canyon floor, building a barrier that looked like nature's doing rather than human design. By the time the first hint of dawn touched the eastern sky, they'd created a blockade that would force any transport to stop. Jonah stood back, surveying their work with a critical eye, then nodded once. "It'll do. Now we hide and we wait." They concealed the horses in a side ravine and took up positions in the rocks, overlooking the blockade, Jonah on one side with his rifle, Clara on the other, with the peacemaker and a clear view of where the coach would stop. The waiting was agony. Every minute that passed was another minute for things to go wrong for Garrick, to change the route for the plan to collapse before it even began. The sun climbed higher, and with it came the heat, crushing, relentless, turning the canyon into an oven. Clara's canteen was nearly empty, her lips cracking, her head pounding with the beginning of another fever spike. She forced herself to stay alert, to keep her eyes on the approach, to be ready. Then she heard it, the distant rumble of wagon wheels, the jingle of harness, the sound of many horses moving in formation. They were coming. Clara's hand tightened on the peacemaker as the transport came into view around the bend. It was exactly as she'd described, a heavy coach with barred windows drawn by a team of 4 horses, surrounded by outriders. She counted the guards, 8 men, all armed with rifles, all scanning the canyon walls with the practiced wariness of professionals. The coach driver spotted the rockfall and pulled up hard, the horses snorting and stamping. The guards converged, and Clara heard the drivers shout, "Rockfall must have come down last night." One of the guards, a hard-faced man with a scar across his jaw, rode closer to inspect the debris. "Looks fresh. Everyone stay sharp." Clara's heart hammered. They suspected. The whole plan that was about to. Jonah's rifle cracked, and the scarred guard's hat flew off his head. The man dove from his horse with a shout, and chaos erupted. The guards scattered, seeking cover, their rifles coming up to search for the shooter. Jonah fired again, deliberately missing, keeping them focused on his position. Clara moved. She slipped from her hiding place and ran bent low, using the confusion and the terrain to shield her approach. The coach driver was distracted, his attention on the gunfire, and Clara reached the coach door without being spotted. Her fingers found the latch locked, of course, and she pulled the lockpick set Jonah had given her from her pocket. Her hands shook as she worked the picks into the lock. Behind her, gunfire exploded in staccato bursts, Jonah keeping up a steady harassment that pinned the guards down but didn't escalate to killing. Not yet. The lock resisted the pins refusing to set, and Clara's breath came in panicked gasps. Then the mechanism clicked and the door swung open. 6 faces stared up at her from the coach's dim interior, children ranging in age from perhaps 6 to 12, their eyes huge with fear, their hands bound, their mouths gagged. Clara's throat closed at the sight, at the terror and confusion and desperate hope in those young faces. "It's all right," she whispered, climbing into the coach. "I'm here to help. I'm going to get you out." She started with the closest child, a girl maybe 8 years old, with dark curls and tear-stained cheeks. Clara's fingers fumbled with the gag, pulling it free, then moved to the rope binding the girl's wrists. The knots were tight, professional, designed to leave marks, but not cause permanent damage to valuable merchandise. The thought made Clara's blood boil. "What's your name?" she asked softly, working the knots. "Lily," the girl whispered. "Are you an angel? Are we dead?" "No, sweetheart. You're not dead. You're going to be free." The rope came loose, and Clara moved to the next child, a boy with red hair and freckles who flinched when she touched him. "I know you're scared, but I need you to be brave just a little longer." Outside, the gunfire intensified. Clara heard shouting, heard horses screaming, heard the distinctive sound of men taking cover and returning fire. She worked faster, freeing child after child, whispering reassurances, even as her own fear climbed into her throat. She was pulling the gag from the last child, a tiny girl who couldn't have been more than 6, when the coach door was ripped open from the outside and a guard stood there, his rifle aimed directly at Clara's chest. "Well, well," he sneered. "The missing governess Garrick's going to be real pleased I found you." Clara's hand moved before her mind caught up the peacemaker coming up from where she'd tucked it in her belt. The guard's eyes widened and he swung his rifle toward her, and in that frozen moment Clara understood that one of them was about to die, and she couldn't let it be her, because then the children would be lost. She fired. The bullet took the guard in the shoulder, spinning him around his rifle, discharging harmlessly into the air. He fell back, clutching his wound, and Clara was already moving, grabbing the nearest child and hauling her out of the coach. "Run!" she shouted to the other children. "That ravine, see it, run there and hide." They scattered like startled deer, their small bodies moving with the desperate speed of prey animals. Clara provided cover, firing twice more at guards who tried to pursue, driving them back. She didn't aim to kill, just to stop, to slow, to give the children precious seconds. But there were too many guards, and they were recovering from their shock, coordinating their response. Clara saw one circle around, cutting off the ravine, saw another moving to flank her position. She was trapped, the peacemaker nearly empty her body, screaming its exhaustion. Then Jonah was there, materializing from the rocks like a spirit of vengeance. His rifle spoke once, twice, and both flanking guards went down. Not dead, Clara realized, but wounded in the legs, neutralized without killing. He reached her side, his face grim. "We need to go. Now." The children, already heading for the ravine. "I'll cover the retreat. You get them to safety." Clara wanted to argue, wanted to tell him she wouldn't leave him to fight alone, but the sound of hoofbeats from the canyon approach made the decision for her. Reinforcements were coming, Garrick's men drawn by the gunfire. She ran for the ravine, Jonah's covering fire, buying her seconds. The children were there, huddled together in the shadows, and Clara counted frantically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, all of them. Relief flooded through her. "Listen to me," she said, dropping to her knees in front of them. "We have to move fast and quiet. Can you do that? Can you be brave a little longer?" They nodded, these children who'd been brave for far too long already, and Clara's heart broke for them, even as pride surged. She led them deeper into the ravine, following a game trail that climbed the canyon wall, away from the gunfire and chaos below. Behind them, the battle raged. Jonah holding off 8 guards, and whatever reinforcements had arrived, 1 man against impossible odds. Clara wanted to look back, wanted to see if he was all right, but she forced herself forward, forced herself to focus on the children, on getting them to safety.
The trail grew steeper, and the smallest child, the 6-year-old girl, stumbled. Clara caught her, lifting her onto her hip despite the screaming pain in her ribs. The girl wrapped thin arms around Clara's neck and buried her face in her shoulder. "What's your name?" Clara asked, climbing. "Rose," came the muffled reply. "Rose, that's beautiful. You hold on tight, Rose. We're almost there." She had no idea where there was. She just knew it had to be away, had to be far from the men with guns and the coach with barred windows and the system that had stolen these children's lives. They climbed for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, the sound of gunfire fading below them. At the top of the ravine, the plateau opened up, and Clara saw their salvation, the horses right where Jonah had hidden them, patient and ready. But there were only 2 horses, and there were 6 children plus herself. The math was brutal and simple. They couldn't all ride. Clara made the decision in a heartbeat. She lifted the smallest children onto the horses, Rose and a boy who looked barely older, and tied them securely to the saddles. Then she turned to the others. "Can you walk? Can you keep up if we move fast?" They nodded, these impossibly brave children, and Clara felt something fierce and protective surge in her chest. "Then we walk, and we don't stop until we're safe." She led the horses, the mounted children clinging to the saddles, the others walking beside her. They moved across the plateau, heading north, toward what Clara didn't know, didn't care. As long as it was away from the canyon, away from Garrick and Monroe and the machinery of evil that had almost consumed them all. The sun beat down merciless, and the children began to flag. Clara shared her canteen, letting each child drink, even though it meant her own thirst went unquenched. They walked through the heat of the afternoon, and with each step Clara listened for sounds of pursuit, for signs that the guards had broken through Jonah's defense. But there was only silence. As the sun began its descent, they reached the edge of the plateau and looked down into a valley where a small town clustered around a church steeple, Silver Creek, if Clara's geography was right. Civilization, witnesses, safety maybe. "We're going down there," Clara said, pointing, "and we're going to find help, real help, people who will protect you." "What about the man?" Lily asked. "The one who helped us." Clara's throat tightened. "He's buying us time. He'll catch up when he can." She hoped. God, she hoped. They descended toward Silver Creek as twilight gathered a strange procession, one battered woman leading 2 horses with tiny riders, 4 children walking with the determination of soldiers. People spotted them as they entered the town, and Clara saw shock and confusion on their faces, saw them taking in the children's bound wrists and gagged mouths, the marks of captivity still visible. A woman ran forward, middle-aged, kind-faced, her apron covered in flour. "Dear Lord, what's happened?" "These children need help," Clara said, her voice barely holding steady. "They need food, water, medical attention, and they need protection from the men who will come looking for them." The woman's eyes sharpened with understanding. "Come with me, now." She led them to the church, calling out for the pastor, for the doctor, for anyone who could help. Within minutes, the church had mobilized women bringing water and food. The doctor arriving with his bag, the pastor directing people with calm authority. Clara wanted to collapse, wanted to surrender to the exhaustion and pain, but she forced herself to stay upright, to stay alert. Because Garrick's men could arrive at any moment, and these children needed someone to stand between them and hell. The pastor, a young man with sincere eyes, approached her carefully. "Miss, you're injured. Please, let the doctor—" "The children first," Clara interrupted. "They've been through. Just take care of them first." He nodded, seeming to understand more than she'd said. "What are their names?" Clara looked at the children being tended to by gentle hands and realized she only knew 2 of them. Lily, Rose, and— She turned to the others. "What are your names?" They told her. "Thomas, Margaret, James, and Sarah." Sarah. Clara's heart stuttered. Could this be Samuel Weathers' daughter? She crossed to the girl, dropping to one knee. "Sarah, how old are you?" 14. the girl whispered. Or, I think so. I've lost track of time. Where are you from? Redemption. I was taken on my way home from school 2 years ago. Clara felt tears burning behind her eyes. Your father is Samuel Weathers, isn't he? He runs the livery. Sarah's face crumpled. You know my father. Is he alive? They told me he was dead, that no one was looking for me anymore. He's alive, and he never stopped looking. He never stopped believing you could be found. Clara pulled the girl into a gentle embrace, feeling her sob against her shoulder. You're going home, Sarah. I swear to you, you're going home. The church door burst open and Clara's hand flew to the peacemaker, but it was Jonah who stumbled through, blood streaming from a wound on his temple, his shirt torn, his face gray with exhaustion. He saw her, saw the children safe, and something in his expression broke with relief. Then he collapsed. Clara was moving before he hit the floor, catching him, lowering him carefully. Jonah, stay with me. The doctor rushed over, already opening his bag. Get him on a bench, quickly. They lifted him together, and Clara saw the extent of it. Not just the head wound, but cuts and bruises covering his body, a deep gash across his ribs that looked like a knife wound, and burns on his hands that spoke of close quarters fighting. What happened? She asked, even though part of her didn't want to know. Jonah's eyes flickered open, unfocused, but aware. Held them long enough. Reinforcements came, but I made it out. His hand found hers, gripping weakly. The children, safe. All of them, including Samuel's daughter. A smile ghosted across his face. Good, that's good. Then his eyes rolled back and he was gone, unconscious, his body finally surrendering to the damage it had sustained. The doctor worked quickly, cleaning wounds, stitching cuts, wrapping bandages. Clara watched numb as this man who'd saved them all was slowly revealed to be more damaged than she'd imagined. How he'd ridden, how he'd fought, how he'd held off a dozen men while wounded, it defied understanding. He's strong, the doctor said, catching her expression. He'll make it, but it's going to be a hard recovery. Clara nodded, unable to speak. Around her, the church had transformed into a sanctuary, children being fed and comforted. Their wounds tended their terror, slowly giving way to the tentative possibility of safety. She'd done it. They'd done it. 6 children saved Sarah Weathers going home. A blow struck against the machine that had tried to destroy them all. But the cost was written in Jonah's blood, in the scars the children would carry forever, in the knowledge of how many others they hadn't saved. The pastor approached, his expression grave. Miss, we need to send word to the territorial marshal. What happened here, this is bigger than one town can handle. No, Clara's voice was sharp. You can't trust the law. Judge Monroe owns half the badges in the territory. Then who do we trust? Clara thought of the ledger of the safe behind the painting of the evidence that could bring down an empire. We trust ourselves, and we finish what we started. She looked down at Jonah, at this man who'd broken every vow to help her, who'd nearly died to save children he'd never met. Then she looked at the children themselves, at Sarah, who would see her father again, at Rose, who would grow up free, at all of them, who deserved better than the world that had tried to consume them. The fight wasn't over. The transport had been stopped, but Garrick was still out there. Monroe was still in power. The network still existed, still fed on innocence, still operated with impunity. But now they had something they didn't have before: witnesses, survivors, living proof of the conspiracy. And Clara wasn't done fighting, not by a long shot. The doctor had just finished stitching Jonah's last wound when the church door opened again, and Martha Chen walked in with Samuel Weathers right behind her. The old liveryman's eyes swept the room, cataloging faces, searching, then locked onto Sarah, sitting by the window wrapped in a borrowed shawl, very much alive. The sound that came from Samuel's throat wasn't quite human. He crossed the room in 3 strides, dropped to his knees in front of his daughter, and pulled her into his arms with a desperation that made Clara's chest ache. Sarah clung to him sobbing, and the entire church seemed to hold its breath around their reunion. "I knew," Samuel choked out, "I knew you were alive. I never stopped looking, baby girl. Never stopped." "Daddy," Sarah whispered the word, breaking on a sob. "They said you were dead. They said no one cared. They lied. They lied about everything." Samuel pulled back just enough to see her face, his hands shaking as they touched her cheeks, her hair reassuring himself she was real. "You're home now. You're safe." Martha moved past them to Clara, her sharp eyes taking in the wounded man on the bench, the other children being tended to, the evidence of violence written across every surface. "You actually did it." "We did it." Clara's voice was hollow with exhaustion. "But it's not over, Martha. They'll come for us. Monroe won't let this stand." "Let them come." The voice was new. Pastor Elias Boone stood in the doorway, his cavalry bearing evident in the way he held himself, and behind him stood 3 men Clara didn't recognize. "These are friends from Silver Creek. They've agreed to help protect the children until we can get them to safety." Clara studied the newcomers hard. Men, all of them, with the look of those who'd seen combat and survived it. "Can we trust them with our lives?" Boone said simply. "They've all lost family to this conspiracy. They have their own reasons to see it ended." One of the men stepped forward, removing his hat. "Name's Jacob Reeves. My sister disappeared 3 years ago, 16 years old, taken from Santa Fe. If what the pastor says is true, if there's a chance of bringing down the men responsible," his jaw tightened, "you'll have my gun and my loyalty until this is finished." The other 2 nodded their agreement, and Clara felt something shift in the air, the balance tipping from desperate survival to actual resistance. They weren't alone anymore. They had allies, resources, and most importantly, they had proof that could bring down an empire. "Then we need to move fast," Clara said, pushing herself to her feet despite her body's protests. "Garrick will regroup. He'll report to Monroe, and Monroe—" She stopped, a realization crystallizing. "Monroe will have to act. He can't let this conspiracy see daylight. He'll come himself to contain it." Jonah's voice, weak but clear, came from the bench. "Good. Let him come." Everyone turned to stare at him. The doctor made a sound of protest, but Jonah was already trying to sit up, his face gray with pain but his eyes burning with purpose. "You should be resting," Clara said, moving to his side. "I've rested enough." He swung his legs off the bench, wavering but staying upright through sheer will. "Monroe is the head of the snake. We cut that off, the whole operation collapses. But we need leverage. We need proof so damning he can't buy or threaten his way out of it." "The ledger," Clara said. "The master copy in Garrick's safe." "Exactly." "And with Monroe distracted by the missing transport, with his men scrambling to find us, that's when we hit the mansion. Tonight, while they're looking everywhere else." "That's insane," Martha said flatly. "You can barely stand. Clara's running on fumes. You're talking about breaking into the most heavily guarded property in the territory." "Not heavily guarded tonight." Jonah's smile was sharp despite his pallor. "Tonight every gun Garrick has will be out searching for us. The mansion will be a skeleton crew at best." Pastor Boone moved closer, his expression thoughtful. "He's right. Monroe's arrogance is his weakness. He thinks in terms of overwhelming force, not surgical strikes. He won't expect an assault on his stronghold while his army is deployed elsewhere." Clara's mind raced through the possibilities, the risks, the sheer audacity of what Jonah was proposing. Then she thought of the children still out there, still being moved through the network, still waiting for rescue that might never come. And she thought of the ledger names, dates, routes, buyers, everything they needed to dismantle the entire conspiracy. "How do we get in?" she asked. Jonah's grin widened. "The same way you got out. They've already shown us their weak point, the carriage house cellar. That tunnel doesn't just lead out, it leads in." Samuel looked up from his daughter, his face hard. "I'm coming with you." Samuel, Clara started. No. His voice cut through the room like a blade. These bastards took 2 years of my daughter's life, took my wife from grief, took my hope and ground it into dust. I'm owed blood, and I mean to collect. We're not killing anyone we don't have to, Jonah said carefully. This is about evidence, about justice. Justice. Samuel spat the word. You think there's justice for what they did? You think a trial and a hanging makes this right? No, Clara said softly, and everyone turned to look at her. Nothing makes this right. Nothing can undo what was done. But if we become killers, if we cross that line, we're no better than them. The children, her voice broke slightly, the children need to see that there's another way, that good people can fight evil without becoming evil themselves. Samuel's jaw worked, emotions warring across his face. Finally he nodded, but the rage in his eyes didn't diminish. Fine, we do it your way, but if any of them point a gun at us, all bets are off. Agreed, Jonah said, then turned to the Silver Creek men. We need you here protecting the children. If this goes wrong, if we don't come back, you get them to the territorial capital. Find someone beyond Monroe's reach and tell them everything. Jacob Reeves nodded. You have my word. Martha stepped forward, reaching into her bag. She pulled out several small bottles filled with dark liquid. Tincture of laudanum concentrated, a few drops in water will put a man out cold for hours. Use it if you need to neutralize guards quietly. Clara took the bottles, tucking them carefully into her pocket. Martha, if we don't. Martha's voice was fierce. Don't you dare say goodbye. You come back, both of you. You finish this, and you come back because those children need to see their heroes survive. The weight of it settled on Clara's shoulders. Not just the mission, but the responsibility of being something these children could believe in. She looked at Jonah, saw the same understanding in his eyes, and nodded. They had 2 hours until full dark. Jonah used them to rest, letting his body recover just enough to function, while Clara worked with Pastor Boone to sketch out the mansion's layout from her memory. Every room, every corridor, every guard post she could remember went onto the paper, creating a map of their target. The safe is here, Clara said, pointing to the East Wing office. Behind a painting of a fox hunt. Combination is 14 to 2733. And if the combination doesn't work, Boone asked, then we improvise. Jonah had appeared at her shoulder, moving quieter than a man that injured had any right to. But it'll work. Men like Garrick are creatures of habit. They don't change combinations unless they have reason to. Samuel joined them, dressed in dark clothes, his face set in grim determination. I've got horses ready, fresh mounts provisioned for a hard ride. We'll need a wagon too, Clara said, for the ledger and any other documents we find. We can't risk them getting damaged. Already waiting behind the church. As night fell, they gathered in the church's small vestry, Clara, Jonah, Samuel, and Pastor Boone, who'd insisted on coming despite Jonah's protests. I served in the cavalry for 12 years, Boone had said simply. I know how to handle myself in a fight, and more importantly, I'm a witness. If we find what you say we'll find, you'll need someone with moral authority to testify to it. Clara couldn't argue with that logic. They rode out under a moonless sky, the darkness so complete it seemed to swallow them whole. Jonah led them on a circuitous route, avoiding the main roads using terrain and timing to stay invisible. The miles fell away beneath their horses' hooves, and with each one Clara felt her heart rate climb higher. This was it. The end game. They either walked away with the evidence to destroy Monroe's empire, or they died trying. The Calhoun mansion rose from the darkness like a monument to wealth and secrets. Lights glowed in a few windows, but most of the great house was dark, and Clara counted only 2 guards on the front approach, exactly as Jonah had predicted. The main force was out hunting shadows, while the real threat moved against their undefended heart. They circled to the rear to the carriage house where Clara had once tried to free 12 children from hell. The memories threatened to overwhelm her, the cages, the small hands reaching through bars, her own failure burning like acid in her chest. But she pushed it down, locked it away. Time for reckoning later. Now was for action. The tunnel entrance was hidden behind false boards in the tack room. Samuel and Boone stood guard while Jonah pried the boards loose, revealing the dark mouth of the passage. Clara stared into that darkness and felt every instinct scream at her not to go back, not to descend into that place of nightmares again. Jonah's hand found hers in the darkness. Together, they descended, leaving Samuel and Boone to watch the exit and secure their escape route. The tunnel was exactly as Clara remembered, narrow, suffocating the walls, seeming to press inward with each step. But this time she had Jonah beside her, his presence an anchor keeping her from flying apart. The tunnel opened into the cellar and Clara's breath caught. The cages were still there, empty now, but bearing mute testimony to the horror that had been housed within them. On the wall, written in what looked like a child's hand, were names, dozens of them scratched into the stone as if the children had been desperate to leave some record of their existence. "My God," Jonah breathed. Clara's hand traced the names, her vision blurring. They wanted to be remembered. Even if no one came for them, they wanted to be remembered. "We'll remember." Jonah's voice was rough with emotion. "Every single one, I swear it." They moved through the cellar to the stairs, climbing carefully, listening at the door for sounds of guards. Silence. Clara eased the door open and peered into a dim corridor, empty, the servants' area, abandoned for the night. "Which way to the office?" Jonah whispered. "To East Wing, first floor, through the main hall, past the library, third door on the right." They moved like ghosts through the mansion, Clara's knowledge of the layout guiding them around corners, through doorways, avoiding the few areas where light and voices suggested occupancy. The main hall stretched before them, grand and ostentatious, and they were halfway across when they heard footsteps descending the main staircase. Jonah pulled Clara behind a massive suit of armor, both of them pressing into shadow as a guard walked past barely 10 feet away. The man was humming tunelessly, his rifle slung casually over his shoulder, clearly not expecting trouble. He passed without seeing them, and they slipped out, continuing their approach. The office door was locked, but Clara made short work of it with her picks. They slipped inside, closing the door behind them, and for the first time since entering the mansion, Clara allowed herself a full breath. There, she pointed to the painting Jonah had already spotted, a Victorian fox hunt, all red coats and baying hounds. He lifted it carefully, revealing the safe beneath. Clara's hands were shaking as she spun the dial. 14, 27, 33. The mechanism clicked and the safe door swung open. Inside was a leather portfolio thick with documents and a small metal lockbox. Jonah pulled them both out, his eyes widening as he opened the portfolio and saw what lay within. "This is it," he breathed. "This is everything. Ledgers, correspondence, signed documents from Monroe, buyer contracts, shipping manifests. Clara, this could bring down half the territorial government. Then we take it and we go." Clara reached for the portfolio, but Jonah's hand on her arm stopped her. "Wait, something's wrong." "What?" This was too easy. "The guards are depleted, yes, but the safe, it's barely protected. Garrick should have—" Understanding dawned on his face, turning it pale. "It's a trap. This office, this safe, it's bait." The door burst open, and Garrick himself stood in the doorway, flanked by 4 armed men. His elegant face wore an expression of satisfaction. "Hello, Miss Voss. Mr. Cade, I've been expecting you." Clara's hand flew to the peacemaker, but Garrick's men already had rifles trained on them. The odds were impossible. Even if they fought, even if they managed to shoot their way out, they'd never escape with the evidence. "How did you know?" Clara asked, her mind racing for options. "Because I know you, Miss Voss. I've spent 3 months studying you, breaking you, learning how you think." Garrick moved into the room, his movements casual despite the tension. "I knew you'd come for the ledger. I knew you'd use the tunnel, and I knew—" His smile turned cruel. "I knew you'd bring help. The old liveryman and the pastor are currently being detained in the carriage house. They fought admirably, but 4 against 2. He spread his hands. The outcome was inevitable. Clara felt the bottom drop out of her world. Samuel and Boone captured or dead. The evidence in Garrick's hands. Every move they'd made, anticipated and countered. They'd walked straight into hell thinking they were the hunters when all along they'd been the prey. But Jonah was smiling. "Something amusing, Mr. Cade?" Garrick asked, irritation creeping into his voice. "Just appreciating the irony," Jonah said. "You think you've won. You think you've anticipated everything, but you made one critical mistake. And what's that? You assumed we came for the ledger." Confusion flickered across Garrick's face, and in that moment of hesitation Jonah moved. His hand shot out, grabbing the nearest oil lamp and hurling it at the guards. Glass shattered, oil sprayed, and flames erupted across the carpet. The guards jumped back, their formation breaking, and Jonah tackled Clara toward the window. They went through it in a shower of glass, falling one story to the garden below. Clara hit hard, the impact driving the air from her lungs, her ribs screaming in agony. But Jonah was already pulling her up, already running toward the shadows at the garden's edge. Gunfire erupted behind them, bullets chewing into the manicured lawn. They ran zigzagging, using ornamental hedges and fountains for cover. Clara's hand found the bottles Martha had given her, and she hurled one back toward their pursuers. It shattered against stone, the laudanum creating a dark pool that one guard stepped in before realizing his mistake. He went down within seconds, unconscious. They burst through the garden gate and found their horses exactly where they'd left them, but Samuel's and Boone's mounts were gone, taken by Garrick's men. Jonah vaulted into his saddle and reached down for Clara, pulling her up behind him. "What about Samuel and Boone?" she gasped. "They can handle themselves. Right now, we survive." They galloped into the darkness, the mansion erupting into chaos behind them. Shouts, more gunfire, the sound of men mobilizing, but Clara's mind was stuck on Jonah's words to Garrick. "You assumed we came for the ledger." "What did you mean?" she asked, her arms wrapped around Jonah's waist as they rode. "Back there, what you said to Garrick. The ledger was always a secondary objective. Important, yes, but not the real prize." Jonah's voice was tight with pain and exertion. "The real prize was making them show their hand, making them commit forces to defending the mansion, to capturing us, because while they were focused here, understanding exploded through Clara like lightning. Pastor Boone, he's not really captured, is he? He's exactly where he needs to be. We planned it before we left Silver Creek if Garrick took the bait. If he focused on the mansion, Boone would use the chaos to get into Monroe's personal study. The judge keeps his real records there, the ones that directly link him to the conspiracy. Documents too sensitive to keep at the mansion, too valuable to destroy. But how will he get them out if he's captured?" Jonah's laugh was breathless. "He won't be captured long. Samuel's tougher than he looks, and Boone was a cavalry scout. Escape and evasion was his specialty. Give them 10 minutes of confusion, and they'll disappear like smoke." Clara wanted to believe it, wanted to trust in the plan, but too many things could go wrong. They rode hard through the night, putting miles between themselves and the mansion, and with each passing minute her fear grew. If the plan failed, if Boone and Samuel were truly caught, everything they'd sacrificed would be for nothing. They were halfway back to Silver Creek when they heard hoofbeats behind them, multiple riders closing fast. Jonah urged more speed from their already exhausted horse, but they were carrying double and their pursuers were gaining. "We can't outrun them," Clara shouted over the wind. "We don't have to, just have to make it to the ridge." The ridge loomed ahead, a dark line against the stars. Jonah pushed their horse up the steep slope, the animal's sides heaving with effort. At the top, he pulled up hard and dismounted, reaching for his rifle. "What are you doing?" Clara demanded. "Buying time. You take the horse ride for Silver Creek. I'll hold them here." "I'm not leaving you, Clara." He grabbed her shoulders, his eyes fierce in the starlight. "Those children need you alive. The evidence needs to reach someone who can use it. I can hold this ridge for hours if I have to, but not if I'm worried about you. So please, please just go." She wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, but the sound of the pursuers was getting louder, and she knew he was right. One person on a fresh horse could make it. Two on an exhausted mount would be caught. Clara leaned forward and kissed him, brief, fierce, full of everything she couldn't say. Then she was riding again, tears streaming down her face, leaving him alone on that ridge to face whatever came. Behind her, Jonah's rifle began to speak, single shots, carefully spaced, each one buying her precious seconds. She didn't look back, couldn't. If she did, she'd turn around, and then they'd both die, and it would all be for nothing. Silver Creek appeared in the valley below, lights still burning in the church. Clara pushed the horse faster, faster, until they were flying across the ground, until the church doors were opening and friendly faces were reaching for her. She fell from the saddle into Jacob Reeves's arms, gasping, "Jonah, he's holding them off it. We know." Pastor Boone stepped forward, very much alive, his clothes torn and singed, but his eyes bright with triumph. "Samuel's organizing a rescue party right now. We'll bring him home." "The documents," Clara managed. Boone held up a leather satchel bulging with papers. Everything Monroe kept in his private study. Contracts with buyers, correspondence with officials across 3 territories, financial records showing payments to judges, sheriffs, politicians. "It's all here, Clara. Everything we need to bring down the entire network." Relief nearly drove Clara to her knees. They'd done it. Against impossible odds, they'd actually done it. "But we need to move fast." Boone continued, his expression sobering. "Monroe knows we have this. He'll be coming with everything he has, and this time he won't care about subtlety or keeping his operation secret. He'll come to destroy us and this evidence, and he won't stop until one of us is dead." Clara straightened, pushing through exhaustion and pain to stand firm. "Then we make sure he's the one who doesn't walk away. Where's the nearest federal authority? Someone who can't be bought or threatened. Santa Fe. The territorial governor has a summer residence there, and the U.S. Marshal's office." Boone's eyes lit up. "The Marshal is James Holloway. He's incorruptible, and he's been investigating disappearances across the territory for months. If we can get this evidence to him, we get him the evidence." Clara's voice was steel. "We get it to him, and we end this. Tonight." Outside, the rescue party was mounting up, Samuel leading them, his face set in grim determination. They rode out into the darkness, heading for the ridge where Jonah made his stand, and Clara watched them go with her heart in her throat. But there was no time for fear. She turned to the children, still awake despite the hour, their faces turned toward her with trust and hope. Sarah Weathers stepped forward, her young face older than it should be. "We want to help," she said. "Whatever you need, we'll do it, for all the others still out there." Clara looked at these children, survivors, fighters, each one carrying scars that would never fully heal, and she knew what they needed, what they deserved. "Help me pack this evidence," she said. "Help me make sure every document is cataloged, every name recorded. Because tomorrow we're going to make the people who hurt you face justice, real justice." They worked through the night, children and adults, side by side, building the case that would bring down an empire. And when the rescue party returned just before dawn, Jonah alive and barely conscious in Samuel's arms, Clara allowed herself one moment of relief before turning back to the work. Because they weren't done yet. The hardest part was still ahead. The doctor had barely finished resetting Jonah's dislocated shoulder when riders appeared on the eastern horizon, at least 20 of them moving fast, their dust cloud visible even in the pre-dawn darkness. Clara stood at the church window watching them come and felt the familiar weight of the peacemaker at her hip. "Monroe," she said simply. Pastor Boone joined her at the window, his cavalry instincts assessing the threat. "He's brought his entire force. This isn't a raid, it's an execution." "Then we make our stand here." Clara turned to face the room, the children huddled together, the Silver Creek men checking their weapons. Martha preparing medical supplies with grim efficiency. We hold until help arrives, or we die trying. Help's not coming, Jacob Reeves said bluntly. Santa Fe is 2 days' ride. No one's getting there and back in time. Jonah pushed himself upright from the bench, his face gray but determined. Then we don't wait for help from Santa Fe. We create it here. He looked at Boone. You said Marshal Holloway has been investigating the disappearances. Does he have deputies in the field? 3 of them, last I heard, scattered across the territory following leads. Where's the closest? Boone's eyes widened with understanding. Dawn Creek Crossing, maybe 4 hours' ride if you push hard. Then someone rides. Jonah's gaze swept the room. Someone rides with copies of the evidence, gets to that deputy, and brings back federal authority. The rest of us hold this church until they arrive. Samuel stepped forward, still wearing the dust and blood of the rescue. I'll go. I know every trail between here and Dawn Creek. I can make it in 3 hours. They'll have scouts out, Clara warned. You'll be riding straight through their net. Let them try to catch me. Samuel's smile was fierce. I've got 2 years of rage to burn, and my daughter's safe. Nothing they can do to me matters anymore. Within minutes, he was mounted on the fastest horse they had, saddlebags packed with copied documents and Boone's signed testimony. Clara watched him ride out the back of the church, angling north toward the creek trail, and whispered a prayer she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. Then Monroe's riders reached the edge of town. They didn't charge immediately. Instead, they formed a perimeter, cutting off every escape route, and Clara counted the numbers with a sinking heart. 23 men, all armed, all professional. Against them, Jonah barely able to stand, herself running on fumes, Pastor Boone, 3 Silver Creek men, and Martha Chen with more courage than sense. 8 defenders, 23 attackers, and somewhere in that mass of men, Judge Archibald Monroe himself come to erase his sins. A white flag appeared, and a single rider approached, not Monroe, but a man Clara recognized as the judge's personal secretary. He stopped 50 yards from the church and called out in a reedy voice, Judge Monroe offers terms, surrender the woman and the documents, and the rest of you walk away unharmed. Counteroffer. Jonah's voice rang out strong despite his injuries. Monroe surrenders himself for trial, and maybe we don't hang him from the church steeple. The secretary's face paled. He wheeled his horse and galloped back to the line. Clara saw him conferring with a silver-haired figure on a black horse, Monroe himself, his distinguished features twisted with rage even at this distance. That wasn't wise, Boone murmured. You've just guaranteed he'll come at us with everything. Good, Jonah said. Angry men make mistakes. The first attack came at full dawn, a probing assault on the church's east side. 6 men rushed forward under covering fire, trying to reach the windows. The Silver Creek defenders met them with disciplined volleys, and 3 attackers went down before the others retreated, dragging their wounded. They're testing our strength, Boone observed. Next time they'll come harder. Clara moved through the church, checking on the children. They were terrified, but holding together. Sarah Weathers, organizing the younger ones, keeping them calm with a maturity beyond her years. When she saw Clara, the girl straightened. We can help, Sarah said. We can load weapons, carry ammunition, whatever you need. Clara wanted to refuse, wanted to keep them out of the fight, but they didn't have that luxury. All right, but you stay away from the windows, and if I say run, you run. Understood. The children nodded, and within minutes, they'd formed a supply chain, passing loaded rifles to the defenders carrying water and bandages, their small hands steady despite their fear. The second attack came from 2 sides simultaneously. Monroe's men had learned from the first assault, using smoke grenades to obscure their approach. The church filled with acrid fog, and Clara found herself firing blind, trusting instinct and the sound of footsteps to guide her aim. A shape loomed through the smoke, one of Monroe's men, His rifle raised. Clara fired first, her bullet taking him in the leg, dropping him. She kept moving, kept firing, each shot placed to wound rather than kill, holding on to that last shred of humanity, even as the world descended into chaos. Then the smoke cleared and she saw Garrick himself climbing through a shattered window, his elegant clothes torn, his face a mask of cold fury. Their eyes met across the room, and in that moment Clara understood this had become personal for him too. She'd escaped him, humiliated him, stolen from him. He wouldn't leave this church without her dead or captured. He raised his pistol and Clara raised hers, and the world narrowed to just the two of them, hunter and hunted about to discover which was which. Jonah's rifle cracked and Garrick's gun went flying, his hand erupting in blood. The man screamed, stumbling back, and Jonah was already moving, tackling him, despite his injuries driving them both to the floor. They fought with savage intensity, Garrick's cultured facade shattering to reveal the brutal enforcer beneath Jonah's civilized restraint, burning away under righteous rage. Fists connected, blood flew, and the children scattered away from the violence. Clara started toward them, but movement at the door caught her eye. Monroe himself stood there, framed by morning light, a pistol in his hand, pointed directly at Jonah's back. "Enough!" the judge roared, and everyone froze. "Everyone lowers their weapons, or I shoot Mr. Cade in the spine and watch him die slowly." The church went silent. Clara's peacemaker was trained on Monroe, but at this range, even if she hit him, his finger would spasm on the trigger, and Jonah would die. The other defenders had similar shots, similar impossible choices. "That's better." Monroe stepped into the church, his distinguished features calm now, the mask of civilization restored. "Miss Voss, I must say you've been remarkably resilient. But this ends now. Give me the documents and I'll make your deaths quick. Refuse and—" He glanced at the children. "Well, I'm sure you can imagine." Clara's mind raced. Samuel was still hours away from Dawn Creek. Even if he reached the deputy immediately, even if they rode back without stopping, it would be too late. Monroe would execute everyone in this church, burn the evidence, and disappear to start his empire somewhere else. Unless she could buy more time. "You want the documents?" Clara lowered her gun slowly. "Fine, but first, you're going to answer some questions. You owe us that much." Monroe's eyebrow arched. "I owe you nothing. You owe those children the truth. You owe every family you destroyed an explanation." Clara's voice hardened. "Why you had power, respect a legacy. Why throw it all away for this?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then Monroe smiled, and it was the coldest thing Clara had ever seen. "Because power without wealth is hollow. Because respect doesn't pay for the lifestyle I deserved. Because every other man in my position was taking their piece, and I was tired of being the only honest fool." He gestured around the church. "This territory is full of unwanted children, Miss Voss. Orphans, street urchins, the offspring of poverty and vice. I simply found a market for them. Supply and demand, basic economics." "You're talking about human beings," Boone said, his voice shaking with controlled rage. "I'm talking about resources, commodities, no different than cattle or timber." Monroe's gun never wavered from Jonah's back. "And I would have continued profitably for decades if you people hadn't developed this tiresome moral objection. Now the documents, final warning." Clara looked at the leather satchel sitting on the altar, looked at the children watching with terrified eyes, looked at Jonah still pinned beneath Garrick. Every option led to death. Every choice ended in— The church's back door exploded inward, and Samuel Weathers stood there covered in dust and blood, very much not on his way to Dawn Creek. Behind him, pouring through the door like an avenging flood, came men in federal badges, U.S. Marshals, at least a dozen of them, their weapons trained on Monroe's force. "Nobody moves." The lead marshal's voice cracked like thunder. "This is a federal operation. Everyone lowers their weapons immediately."
Monroe's face went white, then red, then twisted with understanding. You already had them. This whole time the marshals were already here." Samuel's bloody grin was triumphant. "Met them on the trail an hour out. Seems Marshal Holloway got word about some territorial judge abusing his authority. They've been building a case for months, just needed proof. We gave them proof." Garrick tried to run. Jonah, moving faster than a wounded man should, caught his ankle and brought him down hard. Within seconds, marshals swarmed over him, chains appearing as if by magic. Monroe raised his pistol not at the marshals, but at Clara. If he was going down, he'd take her with him. His finger tightened on the trigger, and Clara saw her death in his eyes, saw the bullet that would end her journey before justice could be served. Pastor Boone moved like lightning, his cavalry reflexes still sharp. He grabbed a hymnal from the nearest pew and hurled it with perfect accuracy. It struck Monroe's hand just as he fired, and the bullet went wide, burying itself in the wall instead of Clara's heart. Then the marshals had Monroe too, wrestling him to the ground despite his struggles, despite his shouting about rights and jurisdiction and his position. It didn't matter, none of it mattered, because the evidence was real. The witnesses were alive, and federal authority superseded everything his territorial power could buy. Marshal Holloway himself approached Clara, his weathered face kind, despite the violence he'd just witnessed. "Miss Voss, Clara Voss, from Chicago." "Yes." Her voice came out smaller than she intended. "Ma'am, we've been looking for you for 3 months. Your family's been frantic." He glanced at the children. "Are these the victims from the transport?" "6 of them. There are others, dozens, maybe hundreds, still in the network. The documents have Roots buyers' locations. We'll find them, all of them." Holloway's jaw set hard. This ends today, not just Monroe and Garrick, but everyone connected to this conspiracy. Every buyer, every facilitator, every official who looked the other way. We'll burn this network to ash and salt the earth behind it. Clara felt her legs give out, and suddenly Jonah was there, catching her, holding her up. Despite his own injuries, she buried her face in his shoulder and finally let herself break. Great sobs tore from her chest, releasing months of horror and fear and desperate survival. "It's over," Jonah whispered against her hair. "You did it. You saved them." But it wasn't over, not yet. The next days passed in a blur of testimony and documentation. The marshals moved swiftly, using Monroe's records to identify and arrest buyers across 3 territories. The children were interviewed gently, their stories adding weight to the mountain of evidence. Sarah Weathers stood before the federal prosecutor and described 2 years of captivity with a clarity that left grown men weeping. Clara testified for 6 hours straight, walking the prosecutor through every detail of her captivity, the mansion's operation, the network's structure. She showed them the needle marks on her arms, the rope scars on her wrists, the bruises that were finally starting to fade, and she watched as, piece by piece, an empire of evil was dismantled. Garrick broke first trading testimony against Monroe for a reduced sentence. He gave them names, dates, financial records that even the judge's careful documentation had missed. The web extended farther than anyone had imagined. Senators, businessmen, even a territorial governor had profited from the trade in children. Monroe himself never broke. Even facing a federal gallows, he maintained his aristocratic disdain, insisting he'd acted within his legal authority. But the evidence was overwhelming, the witnesses credible, and the verdict never in doubt. Guilty on all counts. 3 weeks after the siege at the church, Clara stood in the territorial courthouse and watched Archibald Monroe receive his sentence. Life imprisonment at a federal facility, his assets seized to compensate victims, his name to be struck from all official records as if he'd never existed. It wasn't death. Part of Clara wanted death, wanted to see him hang for his crimes. But another part, the part that had fought so hard to stay human through everything, was satisfied with this. Monroe would spend the rest of his life in a cage,
Forgotten, powerless, everything he'd built turned to dust. That had to be enough. Outside the courthouse, the children waited with their families. The marshals had worked miracles using the ledgers to track down parents, siblings, relatives who'd never stopped searching. Sarah Weathers stood with her father, both of them whole in a way they hadn't been for years. The other children from the transport had similar reunions, tears and laughter mixing in equal measure. But there were others, children recovered from buyers, from way stations, from the dark corners of Monroe's network, who had no one. Orphans twice over, their families dead or impossible to locate. They stood apart, their faces reflecting the same lost quality Clara remembered from her own mirror. Jonah appeared at her shoulder, his injuries finally healing his face, peaceful in a way she'd never seen. "What are you thinking?" Clara watched. The children watched them, trying to imagine futures in a world that had proven so cruel, that they need somewhere to go, somewhere safe, where people understand what they've been through and won't ask them to pretend it didn't happen. "You're thinking about that sanctuary idea, the ranch and school." "I am." She turned to face him. "Ghost Mesa has land resources, distance from the memories. We could build something there. Not an orphanage, something better. A place where survivors help other survivors. Where children learn they're not broken, just bent. Where they can heal." Jonah was quiet for a long moment, his eyes searching hers. "That's a lifetime commitment. Years of work, of fighting to get funding, of dealing with children's trauma every single day. Are you sure?" Clara thought about the woman she'd been 3 months ago, naive, hopeful, believing the world was fundamentally good. That woman was gone, burned away by fire and reforged in pain. But something remained, something stronger than innocence, something that might actually be worth keeping. "I've never been more sure of anything." "Then we do it together." Jonah's hand found hers, and this time the touch didn't make her flinch. "Partners, partners." They walked over to the children, and Clara knelt in front of young Rose, who'd clung to her through the escape, who'd trusted her when trust should have been impossible. "Rose, how would you like to come live on a ranch? A place with horses and open sky, where no one will ever lock you in a cage again." The little girl's eyes widened. "With you, with me, and with Mr. Cade, and with any other children who need a place to heal." Clara glanced up at the others. "All of you, if you want, if you're willing to help us build something new." They came to her then, these broken, beautiful children, and Clara gathered them close, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a mantle. This was her purpose now, not revenge, not even justice, but healing, creating light in the places where darkness had reigned. Martha Chen approached her, practical face soft with emotion. "You'll need help, medical care, education, someone to manage supplies. Are you volunteering? Try to stop me." Martha looked at the children. "These little ones deserve every chance we can give them. Besides, Samuel's talking about moving to Ghost Mesa, too. Says he wants to teach them about horses, give them skills they can use. And Pastor Boone, already drafting a charter for your sanctuary. He's got connections in the territorial government, the honest ones anyway. He'll make sure you get the support you need." The pieces were falling into place, a future taking shape from the ashes of trauma. It wouldn't be easy. There would be nightmares, setbacks, days when the weight of what they'd all survived threatened to crush them. But they'd face it together, survivors, helping survivors, building something that honored those who hadn't made it out. 6 months later, Clara stood on the porch of a newly built ranch house on Ghost Mesa, watching the sun set over land that stretched to the horizon. Behind her, the sounds of children's laughter drifted from the dining hall, real laughter, not the hollow kind born of hysteria or fear, but genuine joy. The sanctuary was growing. 8 children now, with more expected, as the marshals continued to dismantle what remained of the network. Samuel had built a stable and was teaching the older kids to ride. Martha had established a clinic that served not just the ranch, but the surrounding community. Pastor Boone came twice a week to provide counsel and education. his gentle wisdom helping children process trauma without being consumed by it. And Jonah had thrown himself into the work with the same intensity he'd once devoted to hunting. But this was different. This was building instead of destroying, creating instead of ending. Clara watched him now down by the corral with Rose and 3 other children, showing them how to gentle a wild horse with patience instead of force. "You've got that look again," Martha said, joining her on the porch. "What look?" "The one that says you're thinking about how far you've come, how far they've all come." Clara smiled. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to those of us who've been there from the start." Martha was quiet for a moment. "You know there's talk in town about you and Jonah, about when you'll make it official." "Official? Marriage, girl, don't play coy." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks. The relationship with Jonah had developed slowly, carefully built on trust and mutual respect rather than romance or passion. They'd learned each other's boundaries, discovered that 2 broken people could sometimes make each other whole. But marriage that felt like a step she wasn't sure she was ready for. "We're partners," she said finally. "That's enough for now." "For now," Martha agreed. "But someday I might believe I deserve something that good. Someday I might trust that happiness isn't a trap waiting to close, but not yet." Martha squeezed her shoulder in understanding, and they stood in comfortable silence as twilight deepened. Below, Jonah looked up, saw Clara watching, and waved. She waved back, feeling something warm unfurl in her chest. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. The promise of a future that wasn't defined by trauma. Later that night, after the children were settled in bed and the ranch was quiet, Clara sat at her desk and pulled out a leather-bound journal. She'd started it at Martha's suggestion, a record of the sanctuary's work, of each child's journey toward healing, of the small victories that added up to something larger. But tonight she wrote something different. Tonight she wrote to the woman she'd been, the naive governess who'd stepped off a train in New Mexico territory, expecting adventure and found hell instead. "You won't recognize me now," she wrote. "The fear you carried, the shame they tried to make you wear, I've set those down. Not forgotten, but transformed into something useful. You thought you were filthy inside and out. You thought the darkness had consumed you, but you were wrong. The filth was never yours. It belonged to them, to the men who tried to break you, to the system that enabled them. You were harmed, yes. Violated, yes, but never, never dirty. And now I stand in the place you could never have imagined doing work you wouldn't have thought yourself capable of. I've helped save lives. I've created sanctuary. I've learned that surviving isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning of a new one. So rest now, girl from Chicago. Rest and know that we made it, that we're exactly where we're supposed to be." She closed the journal as Jonah knocked softly on the door. "The children are asking for a story," he said. "Thought you might want to join." Clara stood, leaving the past on her desk, and walked toward the future, toward the common room, where children gathered around the fire, toward the life she'd built from ashes and will, toward the man who'd shown her that redemption was possible for everyone, even those who believed themselves beyond saving. As she entered the room, Rose ran to her, grabbing her hand. "Tell us about the rescue, about how you saved us." Clara looked at the eager faces, at these children who needed to hear that darkness could be defeated, that heroes existed, that they themselves were worth fighting for, and she began to speak not about her own role, but about all of them, about Samuel's courage, Martha's wisdom, Pastor Boone's faith, and Jonah's sacrifice, about a community that came together to destroy evil and build something beautiful from the ruins. She told them about choosing compassion over vengeance, about systems that could be bent back toward justice, about the power of standing witness to truth. And as she spoke, she saw understanding dawn in their eyes, the understanding that they were not victims but survivors, not broken but bent toward growth, not alone but part of something larger than themselves. When the story ended and the children were finally ready for sleep, Clara tucked Rose into bed. The little girl looked up at her with eyes that still held shadows, but also held hope. "Miss Clara, are we safe now? Really safe?" Clara thought about the question, about all the ways the world could still hurt them, about the fact that safety was never absolute, never guaranteed. But she also thought about the ranch, about the community they'd built, about the future they were creating together. "Well, we're safer than we were," she said honestly, "and we're surrounded by people who will fight to keep us safe, people who love us. That's the best kind of safety there is." Rose nodded satisfied and closed her eyes. Clara watched her for a moment, this child who'd been merchandise and was now simply a child again, and felt the last piece of her own broken heart click into place. Outside, Ghost Mesa settled into night, and somewhere in the darkness other children still waited for rescue. But they would be found. The work would continue. The network would be destroyed piece by piece, trafficker by trafficker, until the trade in innocence was nothing but a dark chapter in history. Clara stepped out onto the porch and found Jonah waiting 2 cups of coffee in his hands. He handed her one, and they stood side by side looking out over the land they'd claimed for goodness. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what? For pulling back that blanket, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for choosing to help when you could have walked away." Jonah was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You saved yourself, Clara. I just made sure you had space to do it." She leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence, the steady beat of his heart. They stood like that until the stars came out, until the last light faded from the western sky, until the future they'd fought for settled around them like a blessing. And in that moment, Clara Voss, former governess, survivor, sanctuary builder, finally understood what redemption meant. It wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the damage hadn't been done. It was about transforming pain into purpose, about using the worst moments of your life to ensure others didn't have to endure the same. It was about being filthy and broken and used, and then choosing to be something more. She wasn't that terrified woman in the clearing anymore, whispering that she was dirty inside and out. She was someone new, forged in fire, tempered by compassion, stronger for having been broken. And as Ghost Mesa dreamed beneath a blanket of stars, as children slept safe and sound, as justice slowly healed the wounds of conspiracy, Clara finally allowed herself to believe. Not in perfection, not in fairy tale endings, but in the simple, profound truth that some things were worth fighting for, some battles could be won, and some souls, no matter how damaged, could find their way back to light. The journey wasn't over. It would never truly be over. But it was good. It was enough. It was home. And that was everything.